Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Koustuv. I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech. And today I'm going to present our case study on building the social media data collection infrastructure to use it as a passive sensor in longitudinal studies of human behavior and well-being. I'd like to thank my advisor, Munmun Choudhury, and all my collaborators and co-authors on this paper. And So, over the years, a variety of survey instruments have been used to understand human behavior. These instruments consist of self-report questionnaires, which ask the individuals to summarize their experience. However, they rely on retrospective recall and are not able to capture the dynamics and context of the user. Recently, researchers have started using sensing techniques. Popular ones are active sensing modalities, which use ecological momentary assessments, or EMAs. Here, the individuals log their behavior or activity at regular or designated intervals of time. However, this kind of sensing suffers from the limitations related to scalability and compliance, and adds participant burden because they seek active intervention on the participants. So, passive sensing modalities have become very popular of late as they do not require the participants to be actively engaged and allow us to collect the data in an unobtrusive manner. Smartphones, wearables, and social media, all due to their ubiquity and widespread use, serve as low cost and convenient passive sensing modalities. So let me briefly talk about our project Tesserae. It is a large-scale and longitudinal multi-sensor study that broadly aims to proactively understand well-being and job performance of workplace employees. This project recruited over 750 individuals who are information workers across the United States. 4 modalities of passive sensing were used in this project. These include wearables. They continually measure the physical activity and psychological states such as exercise, heart rate, stress, and sleep. We used a smartphone application that tracks location, activity, and psychological states and physiological states such as exercise, and phone use of these individuals. We also used Bluetooth beacons to identify home and workplace presence of these individuals and the amount of time they spend on commute or at their desks. Finally, we also collected the social media data to essentially obtain the amount of their online presence and interaction behavior of on social media. So, validated surveys serve as the ground truth in this study. These surveys include psychological constructs such as personality trait, executive function, and well-being measures such as affect and sleep. And we also used surveys for measuring their job performance. So as I already mentioned, the overall idea was that can this passively sensed data be used to identify, predict, and understand the ground truth measures in a better way. To set up this study, the first step involves to unobtrusively collect this data through the sensing modalities. And given that there are so many participants, and this is such a large-scale and longitudinal study, this data collection process is itself not that easy. For instance, collecting social media data does seem like a trivial task, but because as it doesn't really require hardware investment or implementational costs. However, this data collection is itself not very easy. Collecting non-public social media data has always been a challenge for researchers, and the changing API from the social media platforms make the job more and more difficult every day. Also, things like Cambridge Analytica breach that happened with Facebook can lead to lack of researcher trust in sharing data for the researchers. In this case study, we will go over the social media data collection infrastructure that we developed and how we navigated through some of the challenges. And finally, we'll briefly look over our social media data. First, why should someone care about using social media as a passive sensor? Social media data is self-recorded in a self-motivated fashion in the present, and it's more like a naturalistic setting. This data can be collected unobtrusively to obtain longitudinal data of individuals, and this data goes beyond the study period and can help us obtain historical data of these individuals. Finally, social media alternatively functions as a verbal sensor. It helps us capture the linguistic behavior of these individuals. While most of the research so far has used public social media data, getting access to non-public social media data still remains a challenge. The access to this data is mostly limited to social computing platforms, and to outside researchers, it's really difficult to get such non-public social media data in a streamlined and easier means. Also, participants have privacy-related concerns about sharing social media data for research, and the data access procedure is different for each platform. So this case study introduces an infrastructural framework to illustrate the feasibility of collecting social media data at scale. And like I mentioned, this is in the context of our tesserae project. So our study primarily collected Facebook and LinkedIn data of the individuals, and they could optionally provide the Instagram, Twitter, Gmail metadata, and calendar data. To collect this data, we used the OAuth-based social media authorization. OAuth protocol allows us a streamlined and convenient means of data collection at scale, which is considered to be best practice, being mindful of the data privacy. Essentially, for each social media platform, we needed an application approval from the site to facilitate this data collection. Some technical details: we use a Django-based Python web application, which is based on the Models Views Controller or MVC architecture. The web application was hosted on a secure and encrypted server to protect this data. So we will go over a demo of this data collection infrastructure. We'll go over both the front end and back end of the application in this demo. So in the front end, so this is our tesserae portal, and the participant opens the tesserae participant portal using the registered Google ID. And then this page with social media platform names come up, and as you can see, the participant logs into their Facebook account using their own credentials. This fires the backend data collection, and similarly, they can also provide us their LinkedIn data or other platforms data. So once they are provided the data, they can just log out and close this application. On the backend side, so the user's request from the browser is first handled by the controller component of the urls.py. This assigns the job to the views component or the views.py, where every platform have their own views. It first instructs the controller to show the participant the login screen that we saw, and once the participant logs in to the portal, their OAuth information is obtained, and the model component is called. It runs the respective scraper, which collects the approval information from the settings.py, and we use RabbitMQ-based messaging queue and Celery-based task scheduler to manage simultaneous request of data collection. Finally, the collected data was stored in this PostgreSQL database in separate tables per platform. So given the changing ecosystem related to the APIs, we faced a lot of developmental challenges in our process of developing this data collection infrastructure. One primary reason for this was our dependence on how the social media platforms allowed access to their data. In many cases, the updates of their API documentation were not always in sync with the API changes, and we had to continuously develop and debug our scripts, and many a times these changes were only based on trial and error method. So among the APIs, the Instagram API was the most unstable one, and we suffered from multiple data collection hurdles in that. To make matters worse, in the middle of our study, we also had the Cambridge Analytica breach for Facebook. This led to revoking access to all the user OAuth tokens of our participants and prevented data collection in the study. So our application had to undergo another rigorous round of approval process to recollect the participants' Facebook data, which we eventually managed to do. So finally, we'd like to note that the data, so collecting social media data still remains a challenge outside the company infrastructure, and it necessitates continuous development and debugging. We'll now go over our Facebook dataset. So out of the 757 participants, 587 consented and authorized to their Facebook data, and 67 participants consented but did not authorize. Note that we only asked for consent from those participants who already had a Facebook account. As per our IRB requirements and consent form, we did not collect any photos, media, or private messages. So one thing that researchers have always been curious about is that in a study, who are the ones who are more likely to authorize their social media data? In our data set, we find statistically we find that female participants are more likely to share their Facebook data than the males, who are also less likely to have a Facebook account. We also find there are no significant differences in authorization behavior across age, income, and personality traits. This implies that our data has a fairly wide spectrum of different individuals across different individual differences. So in Facebook, we primarily collected their timeline updates, the timeline data of the individuals. This includes the posts and content shared by the participants and others on an individual's timeline page. We collected over 250,000 about 250,000 timeline updates at about 200 updates per participants. In addition, every post on Facebook can be liked or commented on, and our dataset contains about 1.5 million likes and 500,000 comments. Our dataset shows no differences in data quantity across age, education, and income. However, in the case of gender, while there is no significant differences in the amount of data shared, we find that females receive 85% more likes and 57% more comments than males. Next, we look at the personality traits. We use the BA5 scale to measure personality traits, which measure personality in the big five dimensions of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Higher agreeableness, extroversion, and openness in our data were associated with greater likes and comments received. Higher conscientiousness is associated with shorter posts, and higher neuroticism is associated with longer posts in our data. All of these indicate differences in data sharing and self-presentation behavior of the individuals on the individual difference attributes. Similarly, we also find differences in the quantity of Facebook data across well-being attributes such as sleep and affect. Poorer sleep quality is associated with longer posts, more likes and more comments. Also, higher negative affect was associated with lesser number of likes received. Together, these differences and variability in the data quantity indicate the potential of using social media as a passive sensor to predict and understand these attributes of human behavior. So let us look at some of the takeaways, lessons, and contributions of our work. In this case study, we demonstrate the feasibility of data collection infrastructure for research purposes, which is set up outside social media company infrastructure, and to collect data from multiple social media platforms. We also looked at who agrees to share their social media data for research, where we find no significant differences in age, income, education, and or personality traits. However, female participants were more likely to share their data for research compared to the male participants. We find differences in social media data across individual differences, indicating the potential of using social media as a sensor to predict and understand human behavior. Our work bears important implications for future research that seek to build quantitative models using social media data to assess behavior. For instance, the significant differences in the social media interaction received by females and males illustrate the need of holding gender as a control in such studies. Finally, we also share a de-identified sample of our data for research purposes. With that, I would like to acknowledge IARPA, our funding agency for this project, and all the universities and collaborators who are part of this test project. And I'd like to thank you all, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So do we have any questions? Great. I've actually got a question that I actually wanted to ask. How did you decide what was social media or not? Because you said Gmail, which I wouldn't immediately associate with social media. So I was just wondering how you said that's social media, that's not social media.
You're right. So Gmail is not exactly a social media, but I mean, it's not just for this study, but eventually this was about the potential of building this data collection infrastructure. And so we do have the potential to collect Gmail data. But for this purpose, this study, we were only collecting the Gmail metadata, and for participants who consented to share or whose companies were willing to share the data, we could collect theirs. But yeah, you are right. Gmail is not exactly a social media platform, but their data can also be collected using similar OAuth framework.
Going to go to the back and work my way.
Hi, it's Pat Brundle from the University of Nottingham. I was just wondering that you talk a lot about well-being. It's in the title, obviously, but it actually looks really like a monitoring and surveillance kind of program that you're engaged in here. And I was just wondering where the consent, how extensive the consent process was. Were people able to turn off the tracking and the monitoring at different times, or was it kind of a blanket consent that they gave?
So I see like two questions here. One is about the surveillance or privacy, about that aspect, and about how did we conduct a study in terms of consent of the participants, or whether they were able to collect the data. So about the first thing, I mean, yes, there is concern about surveillance. I mean, any research can be misused that way, but the objective of the study is to demonstrate that passive sensors could be used to proactively understand human behavior or, say, workplace performance in this particular case study, and can also lead to tailored and more informed interventions for their well-being. So when you like measure like the trade-off of cost against benefit, like the privacy-related cost or other related costs versus the benefit of this sort of research, then that question is always there. And as for the second question of consent, so all the participants were made aware of these are the data modalities that will be collected from the social media. And so note that this data was only is a one-time thing. It was not like the social media data collection was tracked throughout their period of study. So they were asked like twice in the period of study, once in the beginning, once in the middle of the study, to authenticate their data, and based on that we could collect their data. So if they're not willing to share their data in the middle of the study, it was totally fine. They could just email us or contact us, and we would not collect their data anymore. I mean, it's only about if they are willing to share, that's when they will log in and they would share. We did not have any access to their data on our own.
Thanks. Blaine Price, Open University. Great talk, and I'm looking forward to reading the paper now. My question's related in an ethics question, but first, a clarification on the technical aspect of what you did. So I've done work with this before where we've used a Facebook app to try and get data, and of course you can't do that anymore. You've got authorization from the user. Can you then get all of their posts and their timeline? Can you then read also people have commented on their posts? So how in the ethics application, how do you deal with the collateral surveillance of the people who haven't actually consented, the friends of friends who've commented?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, actually, and we keep on asking this among us. So first thing, I mean, we are still able to collect Facebook data. It's just that Facebook has disabled some of the data fields, like you cannot probably collect birthdays anymore, or you cannot collect their education, those kinds of things. The timeline data can still be collected if Facebook approves it, but you will probably need multiple rounds of approval. And yes, this data collection infrastructure allows you to collect the posts by the users themselves or others on their timeline. It could be their likes, it could be their comments. So based on what we should ideally be doing is that, first of all, any research should de-identify this data when we are using it for the research questions. And also, so far, whatever we have used, we have only considered the self-post of the users. So any other posts coming from other users, we are getting rid of in the future studies. This case study was only about data collection, but in our future papers or research, so far we have only considered the self-post by the user, self-post or self-comments by the user, because the user is the individual is the one who has consented to their data, not the others in their friend network or others.
Hello, John Rooksby from Northumbria University. Very impressive work, and surprise, another ethics-related question. You said so there was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. You said all the OAuth tokens were revoked. I assume that was revoked by Facebook, not the users. And then you said you had to go through another rigorous review process. Was that the Facebook review process? Do you genuinely believe that was rigorous, and do you believe that review process was relevant? And was there any, I suppose, institutional review process as well that came alongside that?
It was the Facebook review process, as well as the participants also had to log in because their OAuth tokens were disabled. Yeah, the Facebook review process, I think the Cambridge Analytica breach happened somewhere, if I'm not wrong, I think in April. And in May, Facebook just disabled the application. They said that we need another round of approval process. For like 2 or 3 weeks, no data collection could have been done. But after that, they allowed it, but their documentation was no longer updated. So it was more like a trial and error that this field is not working, this field is not, and we had to play with that a lot. And after that, yes, I think it was August 1st, that was the deadline by which we had to submit another round of approval application, that what is this application trying to do, what is the research that we are doing, what is the data collection we are doing, and I think some more privacy-related proof we had to provide. I think privacy statement it's called. I'll not... because I don't remember what exactly it is called. I did not mention it. But after that, Facebook again approved it. It took like a week for them to approve it, and we were able to collect the data. Just that some fields were disabled, as I mentioned. Some data fields we could not collect anymore, which we were able to collect before.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you very much.